Hello and welcome to Breaking Down History. I'm Dr. Dickens,
And my name's Mr. Pritchard.
and this week we are going to be answering the question, why are people so angry about the statue? So what is this statue, Mr. Pritchard, that we're talking about?
Well, the incident that you have all seen, I would imagine, is the statue of Edward Colston, which on the 7th of June was torn down by protesters in Bristol. This made news not just in the city of Bristol, but all over the internet. International news stations picked it up. And this monumental event has started a huge debate about a whole range of things, from slavery to Black British history, and also a really interesting debate about how we remember people from the past.
Now, would I also be right in saying, Mr. Pritchard, that this is an issue which is very close to your heart because of where you're from?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm from Bristol, and as well as being from Bristol, I have a lot of memories of walking past this statue. It's in, for those of you who maybe don't know the city, it's right in the city centre, and it's something that you would have seen if you grew up in the city hundreds of times throughout your childhood, and something that I always had questions about. And to be honest with you, for a long time, this statue always had a traffic cone put on top of its head by people who had a little bit too much to drink. So it was always something that was prominent within the city. What I'd like to do for this lesson is, there are a series of questions that should be on your video now. I'd just like you to write each of those questions down, and underneath each question, leave 2 to 3 lines where you can bullet point some different notes to do with what we're talking about. And then at the end of this lesson, we're going to get you to sort of write your ideas about what should happen next, what you think should happen, not just in Bristol, but across the country, in Manchester and across the world with these different statues.
So to start off, let's have a think about the person who this statue was made of. Who is Edward Colston?
So Edward Colston was a prominent slave trader, and he worked for the Royal African Company in the 17th century. He was probably one of the biggest slave traders in the country, and the Royal African Company was the biggest slave trader in the British Empire.
Now, if we pause there for a second, what do we mean when we're talking about the slave trade?
Well, the slave trade was something that was begun by European powers, Spanish, Portuguese, French and the British, and it involved those European powers taking people, usually from kingdoms in West Africa, sailing them over to the newly found Americas and selling these people into slavery. And when these people were sold into slavery, they would work on plantations, which were horrific, horrible sort of farms and estates, where often these people would be worked to death. And across the years, the slave trade did several horrific things, but it displaced huge amounts of people from the continent of Africa, so it had a horrible negative effect on these West African kingdoms. It obviously led to the deaths of millions of people, both in North and South America, and it also has been something that has had a long-lasting legacy, because whilst slavery was abolished in the 19th century, African Americans, Afro-Caribbeans and Black people around the world have continued and have had to fight for their existence and their rights since the slave trade. And this all comes back to what the British started.
Okay. Now, one of the things that people sometimes say is this. When we're thinking about people like Edward Colston, going back to the 17th century, didn't everyone at this time agree with the idea of the slave trade?
Well, there's 2 things to think about with this. The first being that while some people may have had different ideas about race and about slavery during the past, Edward Colston wasn't someone who just had some racist ideas. His company oversaw the transportation of 84,000 slaves across the Atlantic Ocean. 19,000 of these, and that's an estimate, so there could have been more, died on these ships being transported across the Atlantic Ocean and were then thrown overboard by his company. So we're not just talking about someone who owned a couple of slaves or made a few racist comments. We're talking about someone who, through his business, led to the transportation, death and imprisonment of African people. As well as that, there's the fact that this statue that we're talking about, it wasn't put up whilst he was alive. It was put up 200 years, nearly 200 years after his death. So this idea that, yeah, okay, maybe people in the 17th century didn't agree with slavery, but also 200 years, people in Bristol still felt proud enough about this man to put a statue up of him. And then there's the fact that this idea that, well, did everyone agree with the slave trade back in the 17th century? There's lots and lots of evidence to suggest that from the moment that African people were taken, that there were constant rebellions made, both in Africa, on the ships, on the plantations, and that really shows you that not everyone did agree with this slave trade.
So why is Edward Colston still relevant in Bristol 301 years after his death?
Well, the tricky thing about Edward Colston is that whilst he made all this horrific money, and you could call it blood money really, through slavery, that towards the end of his life, he decided to do lots of things with this money. So he was an MP, he was in Parliament, but he also left lots of money to the city of Bristol. And this money was used in schools, and as a result, if you were to go to Bristol, and obviously it is changing at the moment, but if you'd gone to Bristol a couple of months ago, you would have found 2 major schools named after him, Colston Tower right in the city centre named after him, streets named after him. The Bristol main sort of music venue in Bristol for years was called the Colston Hall, until certain black music acts said that they would never play there unless the music hall changed it. So it's not just the fact that this man made money out of slavery, but the fact that actually the city of Bristol continued to celebrate and remember him by naming things after him.
I suppose what some people might say is Edward Colston, having made all of this money, put it into things like schools. He was what we would call a philanthropist, so he's giving money to public causes. That's positive, isn't it?
I mean, it is positive for those people in Bristol, but I think the thing we've got to think about is, where does that money come from? And that money undoubtedly is coming off from the blood of people who had died and had been mistreated by his company, but also those people who they sold to. And I think, yes, maybe he did positive things with the money, but is that worth the cost of his crimes?
Yeah. Why is he controversial today then?
So this statue that sits in the city centre, that was put up after he had died, a long time after he had died, it wasn't just a statue that explained who he was. If you were to go to this statue, what you'd have seen is a plaque, and this plaque said, "Erected by citizens of Bristol as a memorial of one of the most virtuous and wise sons of this city." Now, if you were a stranger or a child even, and you were in the Bristol city centre, and you were to read that plaque, what impression would you get of him as a person?
Well, I would probably see words like virtuous, which means positive, good, full of virtue, wise, so clever, intelligent, thinks things through carefully. I probably think this was a well-educated, well-meaning, kindly person.
Exactly, and I think that's the problem with this statue, is the fact that it didn't really explain, and it didn't go to lengths to actually show what Edward Colston was, who he was as a person. And that was the problem that people had with this statue and had with the legacy of this man. It's also really important to note that the history of Bristol is very key to this story. If we were to take Liverpool for an example, Liverpool, like Bristol, was a very, very wealthy city that gained its wealth through slavery. However, in 1999, the city of Liverpool apologised for its role in slavery. It also has an international slavery museum that commemorates its crimes and the horrific atrocities of the slave trade. And if we're just to compare these two cities, I'm not saying that an apology makes up for everything that's gone in the past, but what Liverpool has clearly shown is that it is willing to try and remember the slave trade in the right way. The problem with Bristol is Bristol has yet to apologise for the slave trade. It has yet to really remember Colston and the crimes of the city in the same way. And this is why this statue stoked so much anger within people, because of what it really represented. The other thing that is really important to mention is that Bristol has a huge Afro-Caribbean community. And I think one of the things that was sort of pointed out to me a couple of months ago, which is really, really important, is if you were a member of this Afro-Caribbean community, if you were someone who was essentially a descendant of someone who potentially had been involved in slavery, someone who had been a slave, someone who had come over from the Caribbean or come over from America, how would you feel walking through your city and walking through somewhere that you would like to call home and seeing streets and statues named after someone that had directly led to the suffering of your ancestors and your community?
So with that background, let's move on to what happened on the 7th of June. What were these events?
So it's really important to think about, and I'm sure you're all really aware at the moment of what is going on, not just in Bristol or Britain, but across the world. And the fact is that we've had these huge demonstrations across the world to do with the Black Lives Matter protests. And on the 7th of June, there was a Black Lives Matter protest taking place in Bristol. And it was at this protest that the statue of Edward Colston was torn down. So this wasn't just Bristolians deciding, we've had enough of the statue, let's just get rid of it. It comes on the backdrop of huge problems that people, not just from the black community, but from all communities, have with how race is dealt with and issues of racism that are within systems in this country and abroad. And they clearly saw Edward Colston as being symbolic of some of these problems, symbolic of the racism that exists within parts of Britain. So on the 7th of June, what happened is they tore this statue down, as I'm sure you've seen the videos that have gone around on the internet. They took this statue, they rolled it through the city, and they dumped this statue into the harbour. And one of the things that's really sort of impressive from a historical point of view about this is the fact that Edward Colston, where he was dumped, would have been the very place where his ships, his slave ships, would have set sail from in Bristol. And there's something quite symbolic about taking a man who had benefited from slavery and putting him in the bottom of water where slaves would have been thrown had they died on those voyages over the Atlantic Ocean. Also really important that he was dumped in the harbour next to a bridge called Perrow's Bridge, which is named after a former slave who lived in Bristol. So there's lots of symbolism that went on with these protests.
Okay, so why has this happened? Why have protesters torn down the statue, thrown it into the sea, into the harbour?
So like we said, there's a lot of different things going on. You've got the Black Lives Matter protests that are really making people think about race within this country and making people think about how we remember our history, British history, with racist incidents, with the slave trade. But there's also the problem of the fact that this statue was still in Bristol in 2020. And what a lot of people said after this statue came down was that this statue should never have been there in the first place. But even if you think, okay, well, it was put up, in the late 1800s, why was it still there in 2020? Why hadn't it been pulled down? Why hadn't the Bristol City Council or, the local authorities in general really taken steps to get rid of this statue?
Now, I'd like to ask you a personal question, actually. Yeah. Mr. Pritchard, having grown up in Bristol and having grown up around this statue, what do you remember over the recent past, the last few years? What do you remember about what people thought about the statue and what people were saying about the statue?
So that's a really interesting question, because really this isn't, whilst I've obviously said that nothing happened with the statue for a long time, people in Bristol have been fighting for this, to have this statue taken down for longer than I've been alive. And that is because people in Bristol, and that's not just the Afro-Caribbean community, but people across the city have realised that it is wrong to have this statue in place. And as a result, campaigners had actively wanted either the statue removed and put into a museum, or to have a different plaque put on it, something that actually explained Edward Colston's crimes. One of the things that happened a couple of years ago, which was really, really powerful, was someone organised a sort of sculpture to be placed at the bottom of Edward Colston's statue, which recreated a slave ship. So you had his statue, but then below the statue, a sort of memorial to the people that had died on these slave voyages. So people had tried to do these things, but there hadn't been really action from the government to help with the statue. So there are issues with the plaque, there are issues with the statue, and eventually what you see in this protest is people taking matters into their own hands. Now, different people have different opinions on this. Some people think that they should have gone through different channels, that they should have asked for the statue to have been taken down, that they should have gone through legal means. Other people think that this was the right thing to do. If the government aren't willing to do something, then people sometimes need to take matters into their own hands. That's what we see happening through popular protests through British history, with the suffragettes, with the Stonewall movement. Where you stand on that is up to you, obviously, but the matter of fact is that the statue is no longer there. And now there is maybe even a bigger argument going on up in the country about statues, as you've seen with the Churchill issue and other statues in other places.
So why, in the end, are people getting so angry and are people arguing about this statue?
There's obviously people that were angry first off that it was there, but then you've also now got this sort of counter movement where people are very angry that these statues are being torn down. And one of the things that you see in the media is that people think that this is erasing history. And this is actually really interesting because it brings up an idea and a sort of argument about how we remember people from the past.
Can we focus on that idea of erasing history? Because what seems to be the case when people have said this in the media and on social media as well is that if we pull down statues, then we're almost acting as if the people whose statues were put up with them pulling down didn't exist at all. We're just getting rid of them from history.
Yeah, which is ridiculous, isn't it? Because we know that we don't just learn about, I mean, I'm not sure I've ever learned about a historical figure through a statue. And actually the way we learn about things from the past are obviously through teaching, through books, through museums, through television. Statues are probably a very, very small part of how we learn about the past. And actually, arguably, what we usually use statues for celebrating people from the past.
Yeah.
So if we think about Manchester, that's the city we're in. Think about Manchester as an example. The most recent statue that I can think of that has gone up in Manchester is a statue of Emmeline Pankhurst that has gone up opposite the Manchester Library.
So the suffragette fought for women's
exactly.
rights to vote.
Champion of women's history and champion of women's political rights. And that is a statue that is celebrating her. And I don't think anyone would have put that statue up thinking, well, hang on, actually, well, I'm not sure about Pankhurst. There's a unanimous opinion of what we think about Emmeline Pankhurst.
The interesting thing is, if we went back just a little bit over 100 years ago in history, to the time before women had the vote in Britain, would anyone have put up a statue of Emmeline Pankhurst?
Absolutely.
Almost certainly not. And that shows really that the statues that are put up reflect what we think about people at the time that the statues are being put up.
And I don't think obviously there's an issue with the statue being put up in the first place, but we understand that the people that put that statue up had their own agendas, they had their own beliefs. I think the issue is, do you keep those statues up? There are statues across the country, both in this country and in America and in other parts of the world, that were put up for various reasons, but it's about what you do with them. Do you just keep them there forever and just pretend that these people have that we're sort of teaching about them in schools and that's good enough? Or do we have honest conversations about what we do with these statues and how to remember these people? Do we, for example, if you go to Russia, one of the things you can, I remember when we went to Moscow, you can find these amazing graveyards where they've put all these old political statues from people that they no longer want to celebrate. And that's one way of doing it. Or do you take those statues, do you move them to a museum? Do you set up exhibitions so you have a clear teaching of what's going on with those statues? And I think these are the key things to think about. And this is that comes back to the point, this wasn't happening in Bristol. This statue wasn't having there wasn't proper education around it. People tried to have different plaques put on the statue. That was voted down. So a lot of the things that we're talking about as solutions, these weren't happening within the city.
I think it might be important to point out there's a very different message being given out if we've got a statue which is on the street and we've got a statue which is in a museum. If you went up and saw a statue in the streets, it would be natural, it would be straightforward, it would make sense to think this is someone who people today respect. They think they're a good person, they think they should be celebrated. If you see a statue in a museum, you're much more likely to think this is a statue which in the past showed people respected and celebrated this person, but perhaps that's no longer the case. And in a museum, you've got access to all sorts of different information about the people who might be in these statues, who might have been celebrated with these statues.
So you can tell a more complete story.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think the other thing to think about is, whilst this has happened in Bristol, we're not saying that all statues should be taken down. If we were to take another statue in Manchester, for example, there's a statue in the city centre of William Gladstone. Now, William Gladstone was a Prime Minister in England. His father had very, very close, well, he was involved in the slave trade. And there's now a debate in Manchester about should Gladstone have this statue taken down. And I think the thing to remember is that people in history are complicated, and it's not black and white history. You don't just tend to always have goodies and baddies. And someone like William Gladstone is someone that we need to be careful with, because he did do bad things, undoubtedly, but there's a complex history there. Where it's different, I think, is with Edward Colston, because don't think what you can argue with Edward Colston is that he was a good man. He clearly made his money and his career through the sale of people. And that sale of people led to persecution, racism, and untold suffering for these communities. And I think actually, whilst we can maybe have conversations about other historical figures, someone like Edward Colston is a clear-cut figure. He was a bad person, and he deserves, even if you disagree with the methods, to have had this statue removed.
So what happens next? The statue's been taken down.
Yeah.
What are the next steps?
So the statue has been fished out of the harbour. It was on Google Maps for a bit as being right in the water, which I quite liked. It's been now taken out of the harbour, and it looks like it's going to be placed in the main sort of museums in Bristol, which will be really interesting as well, because then it will still be able to teach people who come to the city, but also Bristolians, about their past. But I think the really, really interesting part, for me, the really interesting argument now is, what should be placed there instead? Do you leave it empty to show what happened to the protest? Do you put up a statue of someone that's maybe important to the black community in the city? So, for example, there are people like Paul Stevenson, who was involved in the Bristol bus boycott. Do you put up a memorial to maybe a former slave to actually commemorate the people that Colston made his money destroying the lives of? Or do you do something radical with it? Do you maybe show a statue of the protesters? And I think that's a really interesting argument that's sort of happening in Bristol, but should be happening everywhere. And one of the things we'd like you guys to do is to think about what you think should happen with these statues. And I think what we'd really like you to have a think about is, how do you think people should be remembered, both in this country and across the world? But also, what type of people do you think should be remembered? So we'd like you to go away and research someone from British history who you think there should be a statue of, and explain why should there be a statue of that person. There are loads and loads of fantastic British heroes. There are loads of people within our country's history that we should be proud of. And it'd be really great to see some of your ideas about maybe some of those people and how we should remember them, and why their stories are maybe more, there's more to celebrate with their stories than there are with someone like Edward Colston. Thank you very much.